Now we come to postmodernism, probably one of the most difficult to define art movements, and yet we're going to make the attempt, because postmodernism isn't just an art movement, it's a literary movement, a philosophical idea. It's something that has transgressed, or not transgressed, but has gone beyond merely the bounds of art or philosophy to really define a lot of modern life. Now, postmodernism is, in a number of different ways, difficult to define. It's a theory that involves a radical reappraisal of modern assumptions about culture, identity, history, or language. And really what it boils down to is there are no boundaries, no absolute truths, no definite terms. Everything is effectively relative, which requires us to look at who it's relative to. And it's really relative to the person themselves. Each person has their own relative sense of truth because, of course, we all will look at or experience our reality different than anyone else. When you go outside, for example, while we might all be able to agree that it is indeed cloudy, we can't necessarily agree on the tone of blue of the sky, or if it's a day like it is today where it's kind of mostly cloudy, but is it partly cloudy? What is it? And that's where we start to get these slippery slopes. And you can imagine what happens when that hits the areas of psychology or philosophy, where terms that used to be the basis of argument are no longer accepted as objective. So let's start defining our ideas here. The term postmodernism is used to describe the changes that took place in Western society and culture from the 1960s onward, that arose from challenges made to established structures and belief systems. This is coming out of the counterculture of the 1960s. In art, postmodernism was specifically a reaction against modernism, which had dominated art theory and practice since the beginning of the 20th century, really going back into the 19th century. The term postmodernism is first used around 1970. As an art movement, postmodernism to some extent defies definition, as there is no one postmodern style or theory on which postmodern art hinges. Rather, it embraces from many different approaches to art making and a host of art groups and movements from the 1960s onward, and they can all be defined or described as postmodernist. Oftentimes, we can have conceptual art, which may also be activist art, which may also be postmodern. So you could fall under multiple umbrellas, multiple movements, depending on the perspective of the viewer, which is by definition postmodern, because then you're applying your own reality to a piece rather than listening to the objective reality of an authoritarian figure in the form of an art historian. So you see where this is a bit of a rabbit hole. Now, it is, therefore, perhaps easiest to define postmodernism by looking at its main characteristics. It tends, for example, to be anti-authoritarian by nature. It refuses to recognize the authority of any single style or definition of what art should be, or even a singular definition of what postmodernism is in the first place. And it collapses the distinction between high culture and mass or popular culture, and it tends to get rid of the boundary between art and everyday life. Oftentimes, the art here is talking about the everyday, a lot like realism did back in the mid-19th century, where it was looking at these everyday issues and occurrences and trying to act as social consciousness. Oftentimes, the art of today, the postmodern art, is doing much the same, but they're tweaking their tools, they're tweaking their definitions and their ideas, so that what you have is something getting at these social realities that we all have to deal with, but it's probably doing so with a sense of dry humor or a sense of irony. Postmodern art can be characterized by its very self-consciousness and its self-conscious use of earlier styles and conventions. and its eclectic mix of different artistic and popular styles and media. So mixing all those styles together, creating something new and different.